really, more than anything else, it was the active work of the Spirit in his own heart, his own working through the gospel's power in his life, and connecting that through others. And so you can't really look, structurally speaking and methodologically speaking, beyond what I said about the rhetoric and see what Tim is doing. But you can be a person of substance that way. And that's where the real power came from in Tim's preaching.
Hi, I'm Glen from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. It's our great privilege today to be joined by Collin Hansen. He is the editor-in-chief of the Gospel Coalition, as well as the executive director of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. And it's Tim Keller we're going to talk about today. Colin has written the most fabulous book about Tim Keller. It's called Tim Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation. It is not simply a biography of the man, but it is really about the influences on Tim Keller and what has made him to be the spiritual influence that he has been today. Colin, thank you so much for joining us. Tell me, when did you first meet Tim Keller?
Yeah, so Tim and I met actually appropriately at the first Gospel Coalition conference ever. It was 2007. I was in the process of writing my first book, Young, Restless, Reformed, and so I had asked him for some help in that project. And at the time, you're talking 2007, so Tim doesn't start publishing his major books, The Prodigal God and The Reason for God, until 2008. So he's well known, but not the way that we would have come to know him after 2008. And so I knew enough about him to say, hey, he's an important person for me to include in this book, talking about the rise of this movement called the New Calvinism, but not enough where I wouldn't have thought to. I could still publish the book without him. So I asked for some help, and he said, no, I don't want to do that. But then I said, well, I want to follow up on that. And he gave me his email address, and I followed up, and I said, here are the questions. And then he just answered, yes, no, yes, no. It was useless to me. So he obviously did not want to participate in that book. And then a little bit later, a friend and I had an idea of a series of books that were biblically rooted but culturally engaged, which we had been inspired by in part from him, and asked him if he would help to work on those books with me as the acquisitions editor. And he said yes. And so from 2008 on, he and I were working together, editing books together. And then by 2010, I had worked with him in a formal capacity at the Gospel Coalition, where I've been ever since, which he had co-founded back in 2005. So that's how we got to know each other. And then, of course, just continue to collaborate in a variety of ways over the years. One of the biggest was the New City Catechism project, which he had worked on, and that I was the publisher effectively for that, with music and church programs and curriculum and different things along those lines. But for all those years, Glenn, I just kept trying to encourage other people, especially in New York, somebody needs to write a book about Tim. And for me, in some ways, it just felt obvious. Somebody needs to document what the Lord has been doing in his life and in his ministry. And then we got 2020, we got the news about his cancer, and I realized nobody else had done that, and that's when the process started on this book.
He wasn't the most willing subject when it came to the Young, Restless, and Reformed book. Was he any more willing when you pitched to him the idea of doing this book?
No. The short answer is no. I think, Glenn, the difference in this case was the difference between me knowing him after working together for 15 years versus meeting him for the first time. Because when you had the experience of talking with Tim, at least in the kind of professional context that I did, I can't talk about him as if we were friends for 60 years or something like that. So, he had different kinds of relationships with different people, but in a professional and ministry capacity, he did not like talking about himself, but he was very eager to talk about others and people that he had learned from, what he'd learned in the past, what he was learning in the present. And I think, as you pointed out, Glenn, earlier, that's probably where his interests and my interests aligned, because my history is a lot of writing about evangelical history, evangelical figures, the broader movement in both a contemporary manner as well as looking back in time. And so I think we had so many of those conversations that when the publisher approached him with this idea, hey, let's do a book that's really not about you, but it's about your mentors, your friends, your colleagues, all these people that you've learned from. Would you be interested in that? And that's why I knew, hey, if you want to write about Tim, don't ask him to share his deepest, darkest secrets. Don't ask to see his journals. Just ask him what he learned from Ed Clowney or why Elizabeth Elliot was such an important influence in his life. And when you put all of that together, you will see Tim Keller.
Yes. Yeah. And people do see Tim Keller in this book. It's a marvelous book, and it really it does him a lot of credit, but even more, I think it warms people's hearts to see the way that Jesus has shaped him through so many different aspects, not just intellectual, but pastoral and spiritual in terms of the ways that he's been formed. And you get to know the man himself as well through the whole thing. I guess that was one beautiful tactic that you used to make this not a hagiographical book. Certainly in the UK context where I am, the great fear with any kind of spiritual biography is we don't want anything to be hagiography, and that would be the worst thing if we kind of exalted a human too much. And sometimes I think in the UK people go a little bit far with that, and we can sometimes rob ourselves of the benefits of just rejoicing in what the Lord has done in someone else's life. But how did you try to navigate that yourself? Obviously, doing his spiritual and intellectual formation and talking about the people who had formed him is one brilliant way of avoiding hagiography. But it occurs to me that there was more to it than that in terms of how you kind of walk that tightrope. So tell me about what your heart was in that.
Yeah. I do think, Glenn, that Tim and Kathy are both a little bit British in their sensibilities. They're a lot of self-deprecating bent toward them. You'll see in the book a moment there where Kathy talks about the prayer letters that she would write for her denomination who supported them in their church plant. And she said, these were the whiniest, most pathetic prayer letters written in the history of the church. So there's a self-deprecating aspect to that, or the way she would describe herself as simply a frumpy newspaper editor, and then the leader of the marching band, drum major of the marching band for Tim in there. So there's a little bit of that sensibility to them, but I think the biggest aspect just came when I was talking to the people who loved them, and especially to their colleagues at the church. There was a consistent theme with those colleagues that they would literally cry while they're on Zoom with me because they were so moved. They were so transformed by God's work through Tim in their lives. And then when they would notice me scribbling away and making notes and making sure this was an important thing, they would sort of like reach out through the Zoom call to stop me and say, hey, but you have to remember that when we were working for Tim, we were so angry at him sometimes. We were so frustrated with him sometimes. He wasn't very good at this. And so it actually led to a conversation that Tim and I had where he said over and over again, I'm just not a gifted leader. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. By any rational assessment, any objective assessment, you are a good leader. But by that same mark, you're not a good administrator. And a lot of people who are good at what you're good at are not good at that. So the real question then became, how willing would he be in the context of this book to be able to talk about his limitations, his weaknesses, his frustrations? But for Tim, because of the way he thought about, really the way that he was humble, it actually gave him an opportunity to commend others. it gave him an opportunity to say, I was not a very good administrator, but praise God. That's why I'm so thankful for Dick Kaufman when he came in as executive pastor. That's why I'm so thankful for Bruce Terrell, who came in later after another crisis as an executive pastor. It really gave him an opportunity, Glenn, to do the same thing that he was doing with these historical figures. And I actually think, Glenn, that his humility concealed his genius in the way that he talked. So he would say things like, well, I'm just getting this from other people. And people would stop and they say, yeah, sure, I can see that. He's just quoting C.S. Lewis here. But when you see the composite portrait of this book, you realize, oh no, that was not all that he was doing, and certainly not how he pieced this all together. But as a humble person, he was really trying to deflect from that. And so that part of that's what comes through in the book, but also just those moments in the book where people are frustrated with him, people are angry with him, where he's falling short, where he's doubting whether he should even stay at the church. Those kinds of moments, those meant a lot. And to the staff members, especially, and people who really knew Tim, that's one of the parts of the book that I hear about the most.
Yes. Kathy comes over so well in the book, and I would love to meet her one of these days. I watched the memorial
I think we can
service.
arrange that, Glenn.
Say
that's
again?
a good idea, actually.
Oh, great. I'd love that.
I think we can arrange that. I think that's a good idea you just dropped there.
I would love that. The memorial service. There were so many highlights from the memorial service for Tim's life that was held over the summer here in New York City, and she was absolutely one of them. The other one we'll talk about in terms of a member of the church in Hopewell. But Kathy comes across so well in the book. Why were they like such a great pair? What is it about the two of them that sort of complemented each other?
That is a good question, and it's probably deeper than I or anybody outside of the two of them could ever really describe. Theirs was a deeply intimate relationship on every level that you would be able to imagine. In terms of their ministry lives were so intertwined, as they often are. But when you plant a church, that is a whole family affair. And I think part of the strength here is just the vibrancy of Kathy's own relationship with God. It's not mediated somehow through Tim's, as if, she depended on Tim for that. A good example would be the decision of moving to New York, and where Tim comes back and he says, I've been thinking about this, and I'm not sure this is good for you or for the kids. And so I think we're not going to go to New York. We're going to stay in Philadelphia. And Kathy just erupting in anger, saying, how dare you? That's mine to take to God. You make a decision. You're the man. You're supposed to be the leader of this family, and I'll take it up with God. I think that kind of tough talk in some ways was exactly what Tim needed. And talking with Liz Kaufman in particular, I mentioned her late husband, Dick, earlier, but talking with Liz Kaufman, she said, Tim as a writer, his wife was like an editor in his head and in his home, of course, in that situation, and in the front row of church. And so you've got somebody who she's always giving him that feedback. She's, he's writing a book or he's going through a book and editing it, and she's right there with him in that process. She did also work professionally in Philadelphia as a book editor. And so their lives were so intertwined. One thing that I've thought about with Tim is that he didn't have hobbies apart from reading. But a lot of what he would be reading would be either ministry stuff that they could talk about or that they were living out, or it would be things like rereading Tolkien, which of course she had introduced him to originally. So, and which they shared a love for, or similarly there with Lewis. So, or the vacations that they took. There's just so much overlap in their lives, and that's not the case for everybody. And I don't think, Glenn, that it needs to be a paradigm, but it's simply a way of explaining that there is no chance anybody could have ever written a book on Tim Keller's influences and Tim Keller himself without Kathy being the top influence and getting major attention in that book.
I just remember, I think my first introduction to Tim's ministry was the marriage tapes. So back when there were cassette tapes, and they were being passed around like it was Christian contraband. They were in kind of brown paper envelopes. It was sort of passed underneath the table. These are the secret cheat codes for marriage, and they were being passed around. And the Q&A sessions, I seem to remember Kathy was in one of these tapes, and just the way he kind of spoke of his wife throughout ministry, it was just so integral. It seemed to the man that he was.
Well, and there's a point here that relates, Glenn, to your earlier question about where we discussed humility. Notice that those marriage tapes are excellent. Their Meaning of Marriage book, I hope, continues to be read for generations. It's such a wonderfully insightful and gospel-centered book. But notice that there is not any parenting tapes out there. One of the things that they were both pretty humble about was, we just don't think that we were the best parents. We don't think in some ways we were naturally inclined that way. Kathy was very adamant that she wanted me to include in the book the role that 20-something believers had played in their church in discipling and modeling faith for their sons. She was also very complimentary of how their sons looked up to their dad. And you saw that as well at the memorial service, no doubt about it. But she just didn't, if she didn't think she was good at that, or that was something that she didn't excel in, or they didn't excel in, she didn't pretend to be a guru on everything. They haven't pretended that, which is interesting for somebody who has written on such an incredibly broad array of subjects. But one of them, to me, I just kept going back saying, especially with 3 young kids, thinking, man, I really need a Tim and Kathy Keller book on parenting, but that wasn't going to happen.
That is fascinating. And another thing fascinating is that the marriage sermons were preached in the 90s, and I guess the marriage book didn't come out until about 20 years after that, or thereabouts.
That's right.
Those were some quite... Right. I remember sort of Tim's kind of saying, I guess he did publish the book on social action. What was that called?
Ministries of Mercy.
Ministries of Mercy.
Call of the Jericho Road, yeah.
Yeah, the Call of the Jericho Road. So he sort of released that. I guess he was maybe in his 30s at that stage. And then I remember him saying, like, I wouldn't publish a book until I was 50. And I remember thinking to myself, how do you know you're going to make it to 50? But that's impetuous me. So I don't bank on that happening. So I just kind of shoot out any old nonsense in
Glenn,
my 30s and 40s.
I think Tim was pretty different than most of the rest of us. You mentioned earlier my journalistic background. For journalists, if we write something, you see it. We're not holding a lot in the tank. With Tim, it was, even his voluminous writing is like an iceberg. You haven't even begun to see all that he did write over the years. And that's why he was able to produce so quickly on such a wide variety of subjects, is because that was a common method of his pastoral leadership, was writing out very thoughtful papers on this. And I think the other aspect here is this is pre-internet. So he's doing this just for his local congregation, and there isn't necessarily a venue for publishing all of that. But there's an iceberg of material out there that he's produced and he was drawing from.
Do you think some of that might see the light of day even posthumously?
I pray that it would. I mean, even there's some things that would be very edifying that are even just only on the internet, but have not been promoted heavily as books, that are very, very timely, very insightful. I mean, it's not my call. I don't have responsibility for those things, but I certainly pray that it'll be the case, because I don't think we've exhausted all that God intends for us to learn from Tim.
Yeah. There's gold in them there, hard drives somewhere.
That's right. That's a good one. Yep.
So the book gets into, and we won't have time to go into all the various intellectual kind of streams that are flowing into Tim, from And as you mentioned, the idea that he will drop Lewis into a conversation, but he'll also bring him into conversation with Richard Lovelace, who'll bring him into conversation with R.C. Sproul, who'll bring him into conversation with Edmund Clowney. That takes a real synthesizing genius to be able to do that. And I think your book takes us through a lot of those stages and a lot of those intellectual influences on Tim, and I highly recommend that people get into the book and see those various streams that are flowing in to Tim and the way he thinks. But let's talk about the spiritual and the pastoral dimensions, and maybe all we can have time for is really to take us to Hopewell, Virginia, and then take us to New York City as the two pastorates where Tim took churches. Hopewell was for 9 or 10 years, and then New York City was for much longer. You entitle your chapter about Hopewell, Virginia, as it's the chemical capital of the South. Paint us a picture of Hopewell, Virginia.
I think there's a reason a lot of people have identified the Hopewell chapter as perhaps their favorite. It was probably my favorite to write. There was so much vivid imagery. So painting a picture, there's you're back in the 1970s in Virginia, and this is semi-rural. It's not urban, it's not quite suburban. It's sort of semi-rural, small town or small city Virginia, central part of the state, and you're cresting over this hill, and you look out, and all you see are these smokestacks, bellowing out this yellow smoke. And this one woman who is from the city and older, she's sitting next to Timothy Keller, and she says, "Isn't it just beautiful?" And Kathy's comment is, I think we're all going to die. This is not good. And so that's why I used that title for that chapter. And then I also made sure to have a picture so that people could realize I wasn't making this up. The chemical capital of the South. All 3 Keller boys were born in those 9 years in Hopewell. Just further context, you're talking here about a congregation where a number of the Presbyterian church members, their grandfathers or fathers even had fought in the Civil War. Grandfathers in particular there. You've got only 2 college degrees. They're both elementary school teachers. Most of the members had a 6th grade education. So just imagine being Tim Keller, who is very intellectually keen, teaching himself to read at age 3. All the way through an excellent liberal arts education, an excellent theological graduate education. He excels in both. And he's from the North. I mean, this is a time when those geographic differences are still fairly pronounced, pre-internet and pre-mass culture in some ways. And also he doesn't have a Presbyterian background at all. And then he ends up in that congregation and also with no experience, and also not exactly with a whole bunch of personality to spare that he would be able to step in as just a natural with this. That's an amazing backdrop that I don't think many people had before the book, and certainly a lot of it that I didn't know. And I say that maybe this is the reason people kept using this language. He learned how to put the cookies on the lower shelf for the rest of us, that we could understand the high, these complex ideas about God and about the world and about Scripture. But I just mentioned it wouldn't have mattered where. He needed to learn how to be a dad, how to be a husband, how to be a pastor, how to care for other people, how to love people in ways that they could appreciate. He had to learn how to preach 1,500 sermons in those 9 years, 3 times a week. He had to learn all of these somewhere. It happened to be Hopewell, and perhaps it's the beginning of what we could see as his true cross-cultural genius, was because he first crossed that north to south into the old Presbyterian culture from a guy who was New England and Eastern Pennsylvania and Northern Evangelical Jesus movement background in there. So that's Hopewell. It was a remarkable time for him. Quite different in just about every way from New York.
Yeah, very much so. And during the memorial service, a gentleman called Graham Howells gave just a very moving tribute, saying that very early on in Tim's pastorate, he ended up in Tim's office and had a marriage that was completely on the rocks, and he was not yet a believer, and Tim sent him away with homework and hope in his heart. And I thought that was just such a lovely tribute.
Well, it's also an interesting story there, because Tim did not find that homework was very effective for the most part in Hopewell. And in fact, he backed off it to a certain extent. But in that first person who walks into his door, he's got this early CCEF, Christian Counseling and Education Foundation material, and he's working through it. And I talked to Graham about it, and he said, I still have it. I've got the photos of it now myself. I still have that homework. That was the means God used to be able to change his life, and the Keller stayed in his life in all these different ways. And to the point where, I don't know that I could say that anybody else other than Kathy was closer to Tim. There were other close friends that he had from different stages of life. You saw another one, Glen Scrivener. That was his good friend there in New York. But that was a genuine, meaningful relationship. And so Tim's ability to connect with a lot of different kinds of people was just absolutely one of the Holy Spirit's evident gifts in his life.
And you don't get the sense that he kind of faked it with people. You don't get the sense that he put on any kind of different personality to be with people. He still remained who he was, but somehow that connected.
Yeah, and the one example that I have from Hopewell, this is the 1970s. There's two major American football teams in the Steelers, and then Washington's football team, known at the time as the Redskins, now the Commanders. And Tim, his wife was from Pittsburgh, and his family was there, and R.C. Sproul was one of his mentors. He was, he kind of cast himself as a little bit of a Steelers fan, and there was this evening service where he takes off his clerical garb, and he's got this Pittsburgh Steelers T-shirt underneath, and the thing is, people recognized how he was trying to speak their language, how he was trying to love them, but they also it wasn't fake because they knew it was not him. I don't know. That's a weird way to say it, but he wasn't trying to do it on a regular basis. He really couldn't pretend, and they just appreciated the gesture. But no, I don't. I think Glenn, that continues into New York. He did become a more authentic New Yorker, but that developed over a long series of time, and a long time and who is an authentic New Yorker, especially in Manhattan, except somebody who moves there.
Yeah, right.
And decides it's the greatest place on earth. So this is one of those dynamics. But I'll close my answer on this point. For the first, what we often know Tim for his contributions, it's urban, global, and multicultural ministry. But what's interesting is the first half of his life, there was no global, multicultural, or urban ministry experience for those first 36 years or so. And I think there's a takeaway there for us in ministry. You're always learning, you're always growing, you're always adapting. Even if you're not good at something, that's not a limit to God. And so we're faithful just to go where he leads.
Yeah. So fill us in between Hopewell and Redeemer, New York City, because that wasn't a straight journey, was it? He went to teach as well.
Yeah, Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And I think if we had only known Tim Keller as a professor, I think we probably still would have known who he was, because I think he was very effective at it. But the thing is, he couldn't. It just wasn't big enough to contain all of his interests and all of his calling, because even as he's teaching about preaching, he's teaching about the church over at Westminster. That was only a part-time job for him, even though it was full-time. And also, to set people's expectations here, Tim and Kathy had told me that he was working 2 part-time jobs both of which were actually full-time, but combined, it was less stressful on them than pastoral ministry had been. So that just gives you some context of what it's like sometimes to be a pastor. But the other part, he's working on church planting. He's working on mercy ministry. He's training churches around the country. He became the scout for his Presbyterian denomination, planting a church in New York, which is kind of how he ended up in that position. And he's doing all sorts of ministry. He's doing ministry with the gay community in Philadelphia. He's doing apologetics with Muslims. He's advising 10th Presbyterian with all of this high-level strategic thinking upon their anniversary. I mean, you can just see as a professor, often what we expect of professors is that they're specialists. They focus on their area. They don't speak to other areas. It's really the other end of the spectrum from being a pastor. As a pastor, you have to be a generalist. All these different areas you're expected to know. Maybe that's just another way of saying that his time as a professor was confirming that he should be a pastor, because he just wasn't able to. He would never, I don't think, would have been able to focus on just one thing. That would have been perhaps an odd fit over the long haul for him at Westminster.
Right, but that was not the way that he was thinking at the time. I mean, he was not the first choice for the lead pastor of this church plant.
No, nor was he the lead choice. Not himself, nor anybody else at the time. And I think this is another area that could be beneficial for us to focus on for just a second. When they were trying to put together a pastoral profile for New York City, they had Dick and Liz Kaufman in mind. You've got a couple there. Dick he's from the area, from New Jersey, both educated at Harvard Business School. They had planned their entire lives, I mean, through their 70s. They were just very driven. They were doing street evangelism in Philadelphia with Jack Miller. They were going from church to church doing revival ministry through Jack Miller. And when I talked with Liz about this, she said, yeah, we're just not intellectuals. Like we are go-getters, we're leaders. And that was the thought about New York City. Was New York City is not an intellectual town. That's for Boston. This is a town for people who come there. It's for artists and for people who want to make a lot of money in banking. And so it has a little bit more of what you describe as a jocular atmosphere. And so you'd identify Tim as central casting for somebody who could be at a place like Park Street Church, right there on the square in Boston, but not somebody mixing it up with the artists and also the investment bankers of New York City. And yet look what the Lord did. And so Mako Fujimura would tell me often, Tim he doesn't strike you as having all of the sensibilities of a New Yorker. And yet look what God did in his life. I hope that's an encouragement to others as well.
100%. So what age is he as they move to New York City, and also paint a picture for us about New York City in the late 1980s?
This was another thing I enjoyed doing in the book, was just researching some of New York's history. And it might come as a surprise to a lot of people that in the 19th century, New York City would have been considered the Protestant and evangelical capital of America. And you have this trope that continues all the way through Billy Graham, and in some ways, of course, through Tim Keller himself, that any significant major American evangelist needs to go and do an event or a series of successful events in New York City. And so Dwight Moody had done that, all the way to Billy Graham in 1957, his most important, quote unquote, crusades, as they were called back then. That was in 1957. You had Billy Sunday there in the middle. But by the time you transition into the 20th century, you transition from the early part is the rise of Protestant liberalism and higher criticism. And so you get a real devaluing of the, emphasis on the morals, but not the miracles of Christianity in New York. And that starts that decline. You also get mass immigration, especially coming from places like Ireland, places from Italy, in other words, Catholic places. And the countries or the cities makeup just really dramatically changes by the time you get to the World War II period. And the post-war period, the mainline churches are in significant decline. let alone the evangelical churches, which now this is considered almost like a Babylon, the paradigmatic, godless city. I'm talking about Manhattan specifically here, because the boroughs is always a different situation. But specifically there in Manhattan, in the broader evangelical conscience, which is combined then with significant white flight that was fairly typical of a lot of cities, especially a lot of cities, including in the North in that period of time. So this just isn't the place that you would have put on anybody's list. Like, for example, if you go look at Rick Warren or at Bill Hybels, they're both planting churches in places where a bunch of evangelicals are moving in the 1970s, in the 1980s. Tim is doing the opposite. And even some of the places, Glenn, that you and I have visited back in the 1980s at that time would have been quite dangerous compared to the way they are today. And so, and then not to mention, I alluded to this earlier, who can unite the artist group? This is Broadway, right? I mean, the pinnacle of so much of the American arts, museums and ballet and opera and Broadway, of course. But then also with these investment bankers, these people do not hang out with each other. At least, one group maybe pays for the others, in their fundraising and things like that. Yeah. But who would ever think to bring them into a church together? Not to mention, there's really only a few evangelical churches. And Glenn, this is the biggest point. People kept telling me there may have been evangelical churches, but they didn't feel like New York. They felt like sort of outposts of a different part of the country. And that's where you see contextualization come in. So that's just kind of the picture that you paint. He's in his late 30s. He's still got 3 young boys in that process. They don't have that urban experience. It wasn't their desire. They didn't have those connections to New York that you would assume. And yet they take that step of faith, and God certainly blessed it.
And so is it in 2017 that he eventually steps back from Redeemer Eastside, from full-time leading that church? And if that's the case, tell us, what happened in those intervening 30 years? Like, give us some kind of sense of the growth of the gospel.
Well, at the time, keep in mind that all of these Redeemer congregations are still together in one church. Subsequently, they've now divided in a healthy way with different leaders and autonomous leadership in there. But over that period of time, you see not just the rapid emergence of one large congregation, and it was fairly quick, Glenn. And this is, again, part of the self-deprecating aspect that I think so many people appreciate about the Kellers. Kathy told me, as she's told others, that if you want a successful church plant in a place like New York City, all you need to do is decide where God's going to send a revival, and then just move there a month ahead of time.
Okay.
Right. They're very quick, and I got a chance in this book to be able to tell the story of all these different leaders, executive ministries and Nancy DeMoss and others, DeMoss House, that were so instrumental in doing ministry in New York throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s. And they started to see the Spirit bear some significant fruit, but they led into what became Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And it was a revival. It was an explosion. You're talking about 1,000, 2,000 people there within the first number of years. And then from there, Tim is casting this vision through the 1990s for not just being one big congregation, but just starting dozens, even hundreds of other congregations, starting there throughout New York, well, especially in Manhattan, then also in the boroughs, but then also then to the end of the earth, especially focusing on major urban areas, recognizing that people are moving to cities. This is the whole mantra of Redeemer City to City that he also started, that people are moving to cities faster than the church is moving to cities. And so we've got to prioritize that. And so I think the easiest way to explain it, Glenn, is that if I had said in 1980 to any number of Americans around the country, hey, I'm moving to New York City, if they were evangelical Christians, they would probably be aghast. I mean, they would be, how dare you do that? You're going to lose your faith. What's going to happen? By the time the 2010s and teens roll around, if you said to somebody, I'm going to move to New York City, they'd say, you are so lucky. You'll get to go to Redeemer Presbyterian Church. That's a major change. And Tim would look at these statistics that would show, and these are not accurate, but something like 2% of the population was evangelical Protestant in Manhattan in the 1980s, but then it was 4 or 6 or something like that. Ultimately, they were praying and aiming for 10, because the thought was, if it's 10%, then everybody in Manhattan will know that they know an evangelical Christian there, and they could see the potential that for gospel ministry. But simply put, it's a very different city in a lot of ways from the church level, but Redeemer members would always tell you Tim's vision was never just for our church, it was for the city. And in many ways, through 9/11, through so many other different tragedies and difficulties and time, they also saw a lot of renewal in the city itself, by God's grace through the prayers of his people at Redeemer Presbyterian Church.
And what do you put that down to on any kind of earthly level? I mean, the Kathy Keller answer is the correct one. God decided to send a revival,
Sure.
and they happen to be the people who are in the way of it. But,
Yeah.
He sent it to that place through those people and not in other ways. So what is there anything we can point to, anything we can learn about why it happened and how it happened through Tim and the ministry there?
I think we can, and I don't want this explanation to come across. I mean, the Lord uses means, right? So one of my books is called A God-Sized Vision. It's a history of revivals, and I try to show the conditions that led to that revival, and then the fruit that was born by those revivals. So in this book, Glenn, I'm really just doing the same thing with New York City, but I'll mention a couple different things that, humanly speaking, happen. One of them is that finance laws were changed in the 1980s in the United States that made various forms of banking and investing much more lucrative and much more successful. That attracted young, successful people, many of whom were white at first. Then later on, many of them were Asian American, coming into New York City, making enormous amounts of money, especially at a very young age. That's number one. Number two, of course, is that New York City continued to be that hub for the arts. One of the, in the global scene, but certainly in the American scene. Well, one of the things that Tim realized early on, and this is even one of the things that he's talked with you and me about, Glenn, was recognizing the biblical category of idolatry and the significance of that biblical category speaking to young people, unattached, moving to the city, believing that their time in the city, whether it was short or permanent, would be that which would make their lives meaningful. It would lead to fame. It would lead to fortune. It would lead to them becoming whatever they were trying to become and prove something to whoever they were trying to prove themselves to. But Glenn, the story of New York is not the story of success. It's the story of crushed dreams for almost all of those people. And idolatry was the bridge between the people who got everything they ever wanted and realized that it was actually horrible, that they were becoming horrible people, and all those people who went to New York City and they were watching their dreams die for their eyes, and all those idols of success and money and fame were just crashing down on them. And so he was able to pastorally discern the moment. He was able to find the biblical categories with historical context to bring them to bear on his moment in a way that people could then hear and respond to biblical truth in ways that they might have been resistant to with some other messages. I think, humanly speaking, that's what we're talking about there. And I think, Glenn, it's why he counseled us and the others with the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics to be trying to discern the same thing in our day. And I think it's why he identified identity as that issue in our own day that seems to have a similar level of resonance with people. And it also even makes me wonder if we're watching some of that unravel ourselves before our eyes. in light of some recent world events. So I know I opened up a whole can of worms there, Glenn. So stick on script, but I love that question. Humanly speaking, I think that's what was happening with Tim.
Yeah, and it's a profoundly theological vision that is applied pastorally to the heart, which proves to be apologetically fruitful. And I think that order of things is interesting, because I think so often with apologetics, we don't particularly necessarily think of the heart, and we might not go instantly to the sort of the higher theological categories. But the way you've just unfolded it there, I think that is exactly what Tim was doing. It was a profoundly reformed theology of the heart as an endless forge of idols that was applied to the heart, and I think some of the Jack Miller stuff that you brought out about his time at Westminster and the church experience that he had with Jack Miller, and that idea of sonship and adoption before the Father and getting our identity.
And David Powlison.
Right.
Remember, David Powlison was on the same session with him in Philadelphia. So all of that, the Idols of the Heart and Vanity Fair, I mean, those significant writings from David Powlison, that was also a major factor.
Yes.
With him.
And what was it? So that was so much of the content of his preaching. I always thought with Tim that he was absolutely one of my favorite preachers ever. I wasn't always sure he knew why he was good at preaching. I always thought when I read or listened to Tim talk about preaching, it always reminded me of John Daly, the golfer, who was asked like how do you just drive 300 yards down the middle of the fairway? He just says, I grip it and rip it, and you're like, well, you can grip it and rip it, John Daly. The rest of us hack off into the rough. And so, well, I think Tim was an absolute genius at preaching. I wasn't always sure he knew why he was such a genius at preaching. What do you think enabled him to kind of grab people through the preached word?
Well, I do think there's a couple different factors, and I'm thinking about a theological meeting I was just attending where somebody said, I've just been listening to some Tim Keller sermons. Doesn't seem that impressive to me.
Yeah.
And part of that's just the way preaching works. And I will often tell people, go back and listen to a Billy Graham sermon or read a Billy Graham book and see if you are as impressed as you're supposed to be with it. Part of this, Glenn, is just unction, right? I mean, this is our doctrine of preaching with the work of the Spirit in people's lives. However, I will say that there was one substantial element and then one rhetorical element. The rhetorical element is an adaptation. Basically, this is what he said all the time, and this works with pedagogy in general. He said at the beginning, I want you so focused that you can't help but take notes. You're learning stuff. You're seeing things you didn't see. You're hearing things you didn't know. Like, wow, that person really has some interesting things to say. And then he said, if by the end you're still taking notes, then I have failed you completely there. That's kind of an adaptation, Glenn, of what was actually Winston Churchill's methodology for rhetoric, which of course, he studied this, he taught this, he wrote about it. And his method was threefold. First, it was tell everybody the bad news. Second, tell everybody how you're going to get out of it. And third, tell everybody, end with a rhetorical flourish that inspires them. Okay, I mean, that's kind of a modification of what Tim is talking about in there. So there's rhetorical strategy. But second, maybe it's because I'm a content person, but it's the content. It's the insight. And it's not just that he could connect with what was happening in the news or connect with what was happening on the New York Times bestseller list or in the leading academic and journals of the country and periodicals. It was more of what you've already said here a number of times, Glenn. It was because he understood the human heart. And if you go all the way back to Gordon Conwell, what connected him and Kathy with their best friends, David and Louise Midwood, was talking about their hearts together. I mean, just opening it in a very Edwardsian sense to understand, meaning Jonathan Edwards' sense, of the work of the Spirit through their affections. And so Tim brought that to bear with his pastoral instincts and through his pastoral theology. And that's why when he went to New York, it wasn't just, I'm going to study a bunch of lyrics and plays and books and encyclopedias. It was, I'm going to sit down and talk to people. I'm going to listen to people. So I think one thing that people miss very much with Tim sometimes is, yes, there's all the stuff that I emphasize about Charles Taylor, and his understanding of social criticism. But really, more than anything else, it was the active work of the Spirit in his own heart, his own working through the gospel's power in his life and connecting that through others. And so you can't really look structurally speaking and methodologically speaking beyond what I said about the rhetoric and see what Tim is doing. But you can be a person of substance that way. And that's where the real power came from in Tim's preaching.
Good word. Good word. Colin, you've been very generous with your time. Let me ask you one last question.
Yeah.
It's been 6 months since Tim went to be with the Lord. Tell me, when do you find yourself missing him, and what in particular do you find yourself missing about him?
Yeah, I like this question. I appreciate it. It's what anybody else has experienced in their grief. And you'll sit there saying, oh, I bet I should send Tim an email about this. Or I just finished reading this book. In fact, Glenn, the one that came to mind is the new book, The Identity Trap. And I just thought, oh man, he would have loved this book. He would have loved the way that a non-Christian author made these points that are so consistent with Christianity. He loved nothing more in his preaching to be able to bring that authority in on something. I was like, he would have written so many different essays about this, incorporating these insights. He would have loved that. And just thinking, boy, I want to read that essay from Tim. I want to send him. I want to talk to him about this. I want to hear his thoughts. I just want his counsel on the phone about this thing. Planning a retreat from the Keller Center. What would he recommend? Who would he think that we should bring in to talk for that? It's just all those moments. And then just, I think this is part of life, just getting older. And when you get older, the people who mean so much to you, they die. You think about your own mortality. And you just think in some levels, like, I've lost some protection. It's always comforting to know that there's somebody there who's more wise, more godly, more powerful in some ways than you are. Like some of us, if we're blessed, we think about our dads or about our grandfathers that way. I just miss that. I just miss having somebody that I could lean on, because we get leaned on so much in ministry. It's part of the deal. But you just miss somebody that you could lean on. And yeah, especially as I was spending so much of my summer in Great Britain, in Cambridge and London, and I just kept thinking about, I should ask Tim what he thinks I should do, or ask Tim where he thinks I should go, and he would have loved to give me that advice. But so that's what I miss. That's what I miss about him, and I think I'll keep missing that about him for a long time.
Well, God was very good to give us Tim Keller, and your book has been a great gift to us as well, Colin, to meditate on all the ways in which the Lord has blessed us with Tim and Kathy's ministry. And I heartily recommend that people go out and get Tim Keller, his spiritual and intellectual formation. And Colin, at the Gospel Coalition, tell us what you're excited about at the moment and how people can catch up with you.
Yeah, so just find us at thegospelcoalition.org. I've mentioned a couple different times our work of carrying on a lot of the best of what we've heard here about Tim through the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. Just go to thekellercenter.org. Another thing we're launching is the Carson Center for Theological Renewal. I know that some people get squeamish about the names. Well, so were the men that we named these after, but neither one of these centers is focused on the person. They're focused on the work. And I think it's just a way of being able to honor those people who've gone before us, who carried that gospel message to us all the way down through the generations. So that's all that we hope to do in our day. Be faithful, pass it along to the next generation, just as they did to us. So that's what we're doing through those two centers. And just come check us out at thegospelcoalition.org.
Wonderful. And do check out Colin's podcast. I'm sure you're all subscribed to Gospel Bound, but it's an absolutely fantastic podcast and top of the podcatcher of my choice. And so I hope it's at the top of your podcatchers as well. Collin Hansen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Glenn.